Hello, this is our third lecture in the course Theories of Violent Conflict, and today we'll talk about social identity approaches to intergroup violence. I first want to take you to a film, and that is Michael Haneke's Le Temps du Loup, The Time of the Wolf. If you haven't seen it, try and see it somewhere. It's very unsettling. In this film, we see somewhere in the near future an unknown but major catastrophe has occurred. We see how water supplies are contaminated and livestock is poisoned, and fleeing the city to their second home in the country, a family hopes to find shelter and security, only then to discover that the house is already occupied by strangers. And right at the start of the film, the father gets shot, and the rest of the family, a mother and two children, sort of flees into the countryside. Now, Michael Haneke's Le Temps du Loup is a bleak and dark and unsettling film. It sort of explores the breakdown of a society after a catastrophic event and the actions of desperate people caught in these circumstances. And we see basically how human beings are selfish and cruel and violent and destructive. So one of the reasons perhaps why the film is so very unsettling is the way it exposes, or at least to me, it exposed my internalized colonial gaze, because we're so used to seeing these kind of scenes in faraway places, where people turn into refugees and where societies are, imploding. But now it happens to us, Western Europeans. Who are now on the run in our own country, and it's the landscape, evidently somewhere in northern France, but also the bourgeois Volvo and the second house is extremely close to our everyday, and therefore it makes such an impact, because all of a sudden that society is completely imploded. And underneath it lies nothing but violence and destruction. So we talked about this earlier, about human drives and human nature. Is indeed our civilization just a thin varnish? Are we at each other's throats as soon as political order and the monopolization of violence, of the use of violence, falls apart? And of course, that's a question about human nature that has intrigued philosophers and scientists for centuries. So if we would go by someone like Thomas Hobbes, quite a while ago, he thought about this a lot. Our natural state, the state of nature, to him is a war of every man against every man, very much like Haneke's film. And in his very famous quote, beautiful quote, he describes the state of nature as follows, in sort of old English. So, whatsoever therefore is consequent to a time of war, where every man is enemy to every man, the same is consequent to the time wherein men live without other security than what their own strength and their own invention shall furnish them withal. So we all have to rely on our own physical strength in that sense. In such condition there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, no use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no count of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Well, that's Thomas Hobbes on the state of nature. Centuries later, another great thinker, Sigmund Freud, is equally bleak in looking at human nature. In a letter to Einstein about war, he argues that human beings are driven by an aggressive and destructive instinct. And here it is: men are not gentle creatures who want to be loved, who at the most can defend themselves if they are attacked. They are, on the contrary, creatures among whose instinctual endowments is to be reckoned a powerful share of aggressiveness. As a result, their neighbor is for them not only a potential helper or sexual object, but also someone who tempts them to satisfy their aggressiveness on him, to exploit his capacity for work without compensation, to use him sexually without his consent, to seize his possessions, to humiliate him, to cause him pain, to torture and to kill him. Homo homino lupus. Man is wolf to man. Who, in the face of all this experience of life and of history, will have the courage to dispute this assertion? So that's Freud. Clearly, man is wolf to man. Again, we see reference to Le Temps du Loup, The Year of the Wolf, by Haneke. Yeah, not a very jolly understanding of the human nature. So the work of both men, both men lived in times of revolutions and war. For instance, Hobbes had to flee to France during the British Civil War, and upon return was almost condemned to be burned at the stake. And of course, Freud lived through the First World War and also experienced the rise of fascism in his life. The work of both of them, however, next to painting a rather dark picture of the human nature and the human condition, actually was dedicated to the question of why, despite these violent instincts that we apparently have, most societies are not characterized by a war of all against all. And maybe in your undergraduate studies, you've seen how Hobbes finds his answer in the state and the social contract, and Freud in our ability to repress our lower selves, although that always remains incomplete. Now today we'll look at a theoretical tradition that takes some inspiration from Freud, and certainly remains within this field of the human impulse in explaining violent conflict. However, in the field of social identity theory, and that's the field we're going to look at, that field does not so much see human beings as wolves, but perhaps more as apes, in the sense that we do not stand alone. We're not sort of lone wolves, but we are deeply social. That's their starting assumption. And it's precisely our need to belong, our need for the group, that is key to understanding violence. So in that sense, they're quite different from Hobbes and Freud. So let's look at this field, social identity theory, and its main founding father, Henri Teufel, that you can read about in the book in the second chapter. Now, what is the main difference? Maybe to start out with that, what is the main difference between what we discussed in our last session, when we looked at the anthropological understandings of violent conflict? What I think what stands out a lot is last week or last session, we looked very much, when trying to understand what the group was about, we very much looked at how groups are made, and how violence is an important group maker, is the key to making a group. So group formation and group building was a very important topic in those theories. Today we see that social identity theorists don't do that. They take the group as a given, and they don't question how the group is made. they start with the group as it already exists, and they're interested to see what keeps the group together. What sort of holds the group together? What impulses and needs, and perhaps also instincts, make the group sort of cohere in a way. So it's a different lens and a different set of questions that they pose. So later on, we'll talk about other main differences between these two theoretical traditions. But let's begin by trying to find the core of the theory of social identity theory. What is the core of what is being argued? I'll get back to that. Basically, the core argument that social identity theorists make is that somehow group dynamics is a cause of conflict. So somehow the individual's need for sameness, the need to belong, and at the same time the need for uniqueness, the need to be different, together lays the groundwork for an escalatory dynamics that at certain times may result in group conflict. And interestingly, here you see again the definition of identity built into this notion, the idea that identity is always about sameness and uniqueness, is very explicitly addressed in this tradition. Now, today I want to talk about two main strands in this field, and that is the social identity theory of Henry Teufel and the tradition that he started, which is very much focusing on the need to be seen positively as a group, as an important driver. And then later on we'll look at Marilyn Brewer's school, so to say, the need, that's optimal distinctiveness theory, and there the need for a secure identity is actually at the core of that story. So let's begin with Henry Teufel's tradition of social identity theory. But before I do that, I want to go back to these two. Apparently I cannot do that. So I wanted to show you, and you can look it up later, two journals that are online at Utrecht University Library, and that contain a lot of new research within the tradition of social identity theory. So you can look that up. But we're going to look into the first set of ideas driven by the work of, or inspired by the work of Henry Teufel. And that basically argues that to get from the group to group conflict, there's 4 stages that a group has to sort of go through to end up in a violent confrontation with another group. So this field very much is interested in how groups engage in conflict. And for that, we see how this tradition draws on a very old text, a text by Sumner, which is outdated, but still sort of is the backbone of many theories of social identity theory. And that is Sumner's 4 elements of ethnocentrism. And here you see these 4 steps that we can still see in many of the theories of social identity theory, particularly the first 2, and then the third and the fourth, there's a lot of debate about. So let's look at that. To get from a group to a state of conflict, we see escalatory dynamics. That starts with the first one, and that is the social categorization principle. Again, that's an assumption about who we are as human beings, and that's the starting assumption of the theory, which argues that we have a very deep and very fundamental and universal need to categorize both our physical and our social world. We have to simplify the complex information that's coming into our brains And we do that by categorizing our physical world, apples and pears, but we also do that in terms of cutting up our world in typologies of people and groups of people. Now, if you would be interested in neurobiology and, for instance, the text of Sapolsky, a lot of interesting research has been done that indeed that notion that we have this fundamental capacity to create in and out groups and see the world in and out groups is something that indeed is how we're being hardwired, perhaps, as neurobiologists would argue. And interestingly enough, and that's a sort of a hopeful little message in this rather sort of a bit bleak story about the human impulse, is that the human brain can decide on in and out group instantly, and then often relates to the in-group friendly and the out-group in a hostile manner. That's what a lot of laboratory research shows us. The happy news is that we can be very flexibly switch preferences of who is friend and who is enemy. So although we have this inbuilt capacity to instantly distinguish between in and out, we are flexible in who we consider to be in and out. So it's not that, as you know, for instance, in chimpanzees, through smell or through color, we define who's part of our in-group and who's not part of our in-group. We have a need for groups, but not for specific groups. In a way, the nature of the group is irrelevant, and this is also what we see in many of the experiments earlier. We have a need for the group, but we can be placed in any group and then get attached to it. So it's not based on instinct, such as smell or color or some other sort of primordial inclination to stay with the same or our breed or our tribe. That's not the case. So that's a little side note coming from neurobiology. Read the Sapolsky article if you're interested in that. But that's the first element, social categorization. We have a tendency, a fundamental need to organize our world in categories and also in social group categories. Now, then the second principle is a very important one in social identity theory, and that is we have this tendency to wanting to see this group, as soon as we're placed in a group, we want to see that group in a positive way. So self-worth is very important, and it's both projected onto and derived from a positive in-group evaluation. So that's an important second notion. And these two are sort of not so much contested in the field. The next steps to intergroup comparison and to outgroup hostility, there's a lot of debate about how that sort of takes place. So the third step then is interesting, but already the second one contains elements that help us to understand how we would be able to get to an antagonist relationship with the other, because we want to see ourselves positively. And of course, the only way to see ourselves or to evaluate ourselves, we have to compare ourselves to others. So we can only be smart if others are not so smart or dumb, and we can only be athletic if others are not, and fast if others are slow, and beautiful if others are ugly. So to be able to establish whether we see ourselves positively, we have to engage in comparison. Now, that's the intergroup comparison principle. So here goes that knowledge of the status of the outgroup becomes relevant to assess the state of the in-group. And it's interesting to look at that for a moment. So conflict only starts when the subordinate group views the dominant group as relevant for purposes of social comparison and begins to develop a positive identity in relation to it. I'll say something more about that principle of comparison, because it opens up a lot of interesting synergies with other ideas. Because if we think about that a bit more closely, if we can only establish our in-group positivity through making comparisons to others, then it also is important that we don't feel good about ourselves if we would compare ourselves with others that we don't consider relevant. So I use the example of I like to go swimming. So this is an individual example. I like to go swimming. If I go to the swimming pool, I'd like to compare myself to feel good about my swimming capacities with good swimmers, athletic, fast swimmers, and not with sort of the 5-year-olds or the old ladies, chattering through and just very slowly crossing the swimming pool. So I only compare myself to the one that I find relevant, and very often also the one that's sort of maybe a little faster than I am. And if I overtake that person, then I go home and I feel good about myself. I feel positive about myself. Now, so it is apparently with groups. We can only establish in-group positivity if we compare ourselves to relevant others. And that relevance means that they're somehow close to who we are, or maybe even considered sort of better than we are. And with that, we see an interesting inroad into the work of Freud again, about the narcissism of minor differences, where he exactly in the exact same way elaborates already, very early on, I think in 1916 or so, or 1918, he writes about this narcissism of minor difference. And interestingly enough, much later in the 1990s, Michael Ignatieff, a journalist and later on a politician, who traveled in the 1990s, traveled the world to make documentaries and write about the many ethno-nationalist and religious conflicts in the world. He drew exactly on this notion of the narcissism of minor differences when he was in the war in Bosnia, and basically interviewed and sat with reservists in a small village, Mitrica, and talked to them about their differences with the ones they were shooting at the other side of the valley, Croats, that they actually had been to school with and played soccer with and shared their lives with when they were young and up until their adulthood, but that now were the enemy when the war had begun. So I'll show you a brief quote from Ignatieff, thinking back to that situation and linking what he saw, what was sort of being told to him by these people at war, and linking that to this idea of the narcissism of minor difference of Freud. It is precisely because the differences between groups are so minor that they must be expressed aggressively. So the less substantial the differences between two groups, the more they both struggle to portray these differences as absolute. So again, in this setting of this war, we see villagers that are actually extremely alike and have had similar lives and, look alike and shared pasts and histories, turn to each other and actually have a very hard time telling each other apart, but also basically understanding why they are at war, because they are so alike. So they have to turn the minor differences that separate them into something decisive and absolute. So the aggression that is required to hold a group together is not only directed outward at another group, but also has to be directed inward at eliminating the differences that distinguish individual from group. And here it goes to Freud, because individuals, Freud is saying, pay a psychic price for group belonging. They must turn the aggressive desire to conform against their own individuality. In order to dissolve his identity in serfdom, this villager, this reservist that he interviewed, the foot soldier must repress his own individuality and his memory of common ties with former Croatian friends. So he must do a certain violence to himself to make the mask of hatred fit. And that is very much this dynamic of how in social identity theory logic, groups tend to turn to each other that are actually very alike, because group comparison only starts with others that are actually relevant for comparison and therefore very, very much like us. So it's interesting to see how Ignatieff, not knowing about social identity theory, was actually drawing on a lot of that escalatory dynamics in his review. So, and this notion of identity competition, as it's called, is in the understanding of social identity theory a very important stage that will then escalate into open, overt conflict. But of course, that step to conflict, from comparison to conflict and hostility, is in need of a further scrutiny. So, and again, Teufel and Turner, for instance, give us a set of answers of how can we understand this step to conflict. So we've had social categorization, we can understand that. We had in-group positivity, we can get that. We understand that to gain in-group positivity, we have to compare ourselves, so we get to the comparison principle. And we understand how that also relates to the narcissism of minor difference. But now how then to get to violent confrontations? We have to look at that a bit more deeper. So this is how it goes. In-group positivity is not always established. It's not always possible for a group to compare to relevant others and then establish a positive self-worth notion. So what happens if comparison fails, so to say? What do groups do? Well, there's basically two answers to that question. What happens if comparison fails? There's individualist strategies and there's collective strategies that members of the group can turn to. And the first strategy is based on a social mobility belief structure. We're not going to go into that. We can read about that more in the book. Try and keep it simple and only talk through the headlines of the theory here. But people can try and gain positivity by choosing an individual strategy, and it is by trying to pass from the inferior group, as they perceive it, to the more dominant group. So they can try and sort of use a social mobility a notion and then assimilate into the other group. So pass from the one to the other. So that's one strategy, and we see this happen in everyday life. People move from class, from lower to upper class, move from one ethnic group to the other ethnic group, and in that way satisfy their self-worth fundamental needs. But that's not always possible. It's not always possible to move from one group to the other. And it's also sometimes not what people want, even if they could. They maybe have a deep love for their group, or they may have very deep religious attachments, and very often it's blocked. It's not possible because of the color of your skin, because of the social status you're in. You're just simply not being allowed into another social group. So what happens then? Then the group has to turn to other strategies, and they have to try and change relationships between groups as a whole. So there we move from an individualist strategy, just yourself and your family trying to move up. If that's impossible, it means that you have to change the relationship of your inferior group to the group that you are sort of competing with, so to say. And with that, we move to collective strategies of change. And again, there's a set of possibilities there for groups. One set is what we see a lot in the field of subaltern studies, and that is what's called symbolic inversion. You see how groups that feel they are placed in an inferior position reinvent themselves by emphasizing their strong points and relating that to what they then turn into weak points of the other group. So a very well-known example is the slogan "Black is Beautiful" by the African American civil rights movement, to all of a sudden turn that was considered a weak thing into a proud and strong self-identifier. So just to turn the table, symbolic inversion of power relations. Another thing that we see that's similar to that, we see an effort to change the way comparisons are made by stressing other factors, such as, for instance, in Mexico, where I've done a lot of research, we see this sort of how indigenous communities try and deal with this, cope with this negative stigma that's placed on them by emphasizing how they have native wisdoms, versus the cold and emptiness of the upper classes and their economic successes. You also see it in terms of false and true religious scripts, notions. So that's another second strategy. But if all that doesn't work, basically, then the only answer would be to actually hurt the other group, weaken the outgroup, and in that way establish self-worth and positivity. And that is, of course, that last strategy is the strategy that explains the step to violence and hostility, active hostilities. So that is again what Teufel and Turner argue, that it is plausible to hypothesize that when a group's action for positive distinctiveness and self-worth is frustrated, impeded, or in any other way actively prevented by an outgroup, this will promote over-conflict and hostility between the groups, because then the only thing that's left for them is the only way to achieve self-worth is to do this at the expense of the other group, and therefore by attacking the other group. So this is, in a nutshell, how we understand in social identity theory the movement from groups to group conflict. Okie dokie. Now, if we would look at recent journals in the field, then you see that a lot of this logic is still, and this underlying assumptions are still very much at the base of these theories, and how they're being refined and applied to particular cases of violence and violent conflict, very often in laboratory settings though. I want to move to Marilyn Brewer, who also is very influential in the field, and she, for a large part, sort of thinks in the same way, starting with sort of similar assumptions about human beings and what drives human beings, but is different in critiquing social identity theorists such as Teufel and Turner for this fourth step. She thinks that's not very convincing. For people to engage in violence and hostilities there has to be something much more emotional involved, and not sort of the mechanistic failure of establishing positivity. That is not enough to make people violent, she would argue. So she wants to bring in way more the role of emotions in this fourth step, or in this step from 3 to 4, in explaining the step to violence. We have to be rethinking that, she would argue. So her theory of optimal distinctiveness argues uses a set of different fundamental assumptions about our needs and what drives us. And she dismisses this notion that we have this deep felt need for in-group positivity. She says, no, that's not the case. We have a very deep need for two things. And again, we can see how the elements of sameness and uniqueness are playing a role here. We have a deeply universal need for a secure inclusion. So secure inclusion in an identity group. So we have to feel similar with our in-group and feel safe within that in-group. So that's our need for sameness. But that need for sameness has limits, because at the same time we have a deeply felt need to feel different, to distinguish ourselves from others. And we have to therefore, we're always seeking for a secure differentiation. So through intergroup distinction. So we want to be the same and secure in a group, and we want to be different in the sense that we want to stand out as a group. Our group has to be different from others. And that's her starting point. So we have, again, uniqueness and sameness built into our fundamental needs for a secure identity, because that's what it all comes down to. We have a need for a secure identity, and we need secure inclusion and secure differentiation for that. Now, I go through this a little quick, but then from that it comes, well, then if there's basically two potential threats to a person's secure identity. So there's threat number one, loss of secure sense of inclusion and fit. So this happens when people feel they're falling out of the group, that they're perhaps sort of pushed to the margins of the group. They lose particular status. They're not considered to be real members, perhaps, of the group. And in order to re-establish a close fit, they have a strategy. And that strategy is derogation of others. Because if you emphasize the difference between you and others, that will increase in-group similarity between the self and your in-group. It will sort of re-establish the boundary between us and them, and that is a strategy to again feel closely included into your group. Now, if you look at what kind of practices promote that, is very often acts of intolerance, discrimination, showing of disgust and looking down upon other groups, issues of moral superiority, avoidance, and discrimination. Those sort of acts will help to again make sure there's a close fit again between you and your group. So that's mostly how people then cope with this fear of falling out. They start looking down, discriminating others, outsiders. And you could picture that, right? You could see that happen, maybe. Okay, then there's a second threat, and that has to do with uniqueness, and that is the moment we fear we losing our distinctiveness as a group. And that could happen because of social changes, because of migration, because of changes in society. And this fear of the loss of distinctiveness, can be provoked by the prospect of close contact or integration or invasion of others into your neighborhood or into your country or into your group, even into your professional group. Now, if that happens, the fear of losing your distinctiveness that will, according to Brewer, stir emotions that are more dangerous, perhaps, than the first threat, because this will propel emotions not so much of contempt and looking down upon, but anger. And also emotions that propel action against the outgroup rather than avoidance. And then in her analysis, she would argue, so those two sets of emotions together are very important to understand how we end up in violent confrontations between groups. Because the combined emotions of contempt, engendered by superiority in the service of insecure identity, and anger, and that is engendered by fear of invasion and loss of distinctiveness, together provide the potent ingredients that are sufficient to kindle hatred, expulsion, and even ethnic cleansing, in her theory. So that is how Brewer understands the step from group to violent confrontations, and the important role of a secure identity security. There's a lot of research being done today on self-uncertainty and uncertainty of falling out of the group, and how that may provoke a tendency to be wanting to part of very explicitly strong groups with very strong moral codes and codes of behavior. In the book you can read more about that. So there's a whole field that looks into this need for for a secure identity, and how that may lead into wanting to be part of extremist groups with strong rules about who's in and who's out, and strong, detailed, micromanaged codes of conduct. Okay. But let's step out of social identity theories for a minute and look at possible critiques. Well, a number of critiques that we can hear is that, yeah, this is all very interesting, but it doesn't help us to explain, if we, for instance, go back to Ignatieff and sit in the village where Serbian and Croatian reservists are shooting at each other while they've been living there, sharing their lives previously, intimately. So it doesn't answer the question of why do certain identities become pervasive in conflict? How do certain groups then turn to each other and engage in this sort of dynamics of conflict, competition, and comparison? So it doesn't help us to explain that at all. And why do people perceive they're being threatened? And what is this positivity and inferiority? Sort of how is that established? Is that something people will, automatically know and engage then in to sort of overcome, or sort of how does that happen? And then again, sort of, we see societies generally with a high social structural complexity, in the sense that we're part of a zillion groups in our everyday life. We have professional groups, we have perhaps ethnic groups, we have religious groups, we have sports attachments, we have all kinds of group formations, gender groups. So why is it that then certain groups are being singled out and turn violent in certain cases? Isn't that the work of politicians and elites and specialists? And how important is that element of the fundamental need that is apparently driving all this in social identity theories? Isn't it only when difference is made to matter through politics and power that we see violence erupting? So there's a lot of debate about that, and we can talk about that. But I want to take you to the main questions of the book and see how these are answered from this perspective of social identity theories. So first question is about what makes the group. And we see indeed here that social identity theories are not about basically answering that question. They only begin their research when the group is there already. But they have an understanding of what drives people to want to be part of groups. And that is actually at the essence of their theory. So the group emerges from individual cognitive processes which stem from the human need, very deeply fundamental need for order, categorization, self-esteem, and identity security. So we have a deep need for the group, and that's why we have a group. And what kind of groups we have, that's not for social identity theorists to look into. So, and that's important to point out, because otherwise we get a debate, or we start critiquing a theory about things that they don't claim to do. So it's not the task of social identity theories to study why people are categorized in certain ways, but rather to explain what possible social dynamics result as soon as we become part of a group. And what then are the forces driving this dynamic? So their starting point is, if you're placed in a group, then there's a certain dynamics that may result in violence. Okay, so that's the group. What makes the group? A deeply felt need to belong. And then how and why do groups resort to violence? Well, the answer to that, I would argue, is group violence only occurs as a response to a collective coping strategy in the service of trying to maintain or restore identity, status, and security. So this notion that we need to have stable identities, secure, stable identities, either by making sure we see ourselves positively, or by making sure we're feeling both same and unique enough, is what then also is the reason for why groups engage in violence. That is to actually make sure that that is restored, or that's basically restored if it's not the case. So group violence is a collective coping strategy in the service of maintaining or restoring identity, status, and identity security. And how and why do or don't groups stop as soon as they are engaged in this dynamic of violence? Well, in a simplistic world, in a sort of theoretical world, violence will stop when status differences are again seen as legitimate and stable, and people's needs for secure inclusion and differentiation are satisfied. But of course, it's also acknowledged by social identity theorists that as soon as as violence begins, this is very often a negative sum game. It's very hard to reestablish this kind of security through violence and conflict. Often that certainly doesn't happen automatically. But that would be the ideal end state, to reestablish status identity as a stable identity status. So if we think about the main differences between the two theories that we talked about so far, so last week about the more constructivist notions of identity and the relation to violence, and today social identity theorists, we see quite a big difference, I'd argue, where in constructivism, conflict is very much understood as politically made and constructed, and also specific in its historical and social and cultural contexts. In social identity theory, there's another story told to us, and that is that conflict somehow is inherent to more universal and natural processes of social group dynamics. So it is somehow inherent to our social psychological makeup, and with that there's implications in the sense that in constructivism, conflict is not inevitable because it's made and constructed. It can also be unmade and deconstructed. Whereas in social identity theory, somehow these fundamental needs that we have are forces that we cannot unmake, in a sense. And what is implied that at certain moments in time, if these needs are not being satisfied, this will inevitably trigger a certain dynamics that also almost naturally and inevitably will end up in violent confrontations. So there's a quite a difference in understanding the whole phenomenon as conflict, as something that's politically constructed and not inevitable, versus something that is almost part of our human nature and something that erupts sometimes automatically and also almost naturally. Another main difference is that social identity theory implies that this is something of a universal and natural process that is the same in all human beings. So it doesn't matter where we are in the world, this is a natural phenomenon. Whereas constructivism clearly tells us a story about, well, these are specific circumstances that may arise, and these may be strategies that certain elites or specialists of violence pursue in particular historical contexts, and that may or may not lead to violence and may or may not be successful. So there's something much more contingent and much more contextual about these phenomena. They don't happen the same way everywhere to everyone. So with that, we see quite a difference in ontological and epistemological stances that we can discuss further on and that are outlaid in the book more in detail. So with that, I close this session on social identity theory. Next session will be about something really different. We're going to step away from actors and their inner needs or their drives for power or for group belonging. And we're going to move and look into a completely different set of ideas that argue that we shouldn't focus so much on the individual and the human being and the actor as a source of violence. We should look at the organization of societies to find the answer of why we see violence in the world today. So see you next time, and this is it for now. Bye-bye.